Hear me? All right, I want to thank everyone for being with us today. Thanks for sticking with us. We have a great panel planned for this afternoon on something we've been talking about a little bit earlier in the conference, but it's an important conversation I think we ought to continue. My name is Russ Martin, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Government Relations at GHSA. And well, first of all, I hope you all have had a great first day at the conference this afternoon, had a chance to go visit the exhibit hall during our last break, sponsored by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. For our session today, we're going to continue the conversation about autonomous vehicle technology. On August 31st, GHSA released a new report called Law Enforcement, First Responders, and Crash Investigatory Preparation for Automated Vehicle Technology, which is a mouthful, but I hope you had a chance to read it because there's a lot of really great stuff in there. It was sponsored by State Farm. And it was actually the latest in a series of releases that GHSA has been putting out over the last several years to help our members, the state highway safety offices, and our community get ready for this new vehicle technology that is coming onto our roads. So before we get started, I want to ask a couple questions and get kind of a sense of where the audience is on this issue. So how many people here think they pretty clearly know the differences between the different levels of automation, by show of hands? Yeah, most everyone. How many people here have actually seen an autonomous vehicle in person? A lot of people. How many people here have actually ridden in one of those vehicles? All right, excellent. There's more of them out there than you would have thought, right? So for our friends in the audience who are in a law enforcement or a first responder position, how many of you have been involved in investigating or responding to a crash involving a vehicle with automated vehicle technology on board? How many within that same community have been involved in a traffic stop with such a vehicle? Well, that's, I think, what we want to talk about, because I think there's a wide range of understanding of what constitutes automation or autonomous vehicle technology, because it's clearly a diverse understanding. And I think some of the things we'd like to touch on today is it's not just what we think of as the fully self-driving car, but a lot of lower level types of automation and sophisticated driver assistance features. They're actually on the road today, talking about features you may have heard of or may even have on cars that you own, like Hyundai and Kia's Highway Driving Assist, Tesla Autopilot, which is well known, Ford's Blue Cruise, GM's Super Cruise. There are similar features from BMW, Subaru, Daimler, and more. According to some analysts, 30% of the new vehicles sold in the United States in the first quarter of 2020 had level 2 autonomous features in them. So for all of you who don't think you've responded to a crash or had a traffic stop, you might have and may not have even known it. So I guess the question is, how do we bridge that gap, and how do we prepare this community for what they need to know as more and more of this vehicle technology takes to the road? I want to note that this session is being webcast live. I want to thank our online audience for joining us. And when the time comes, we'll ask you to use the microphones for their benefit. But let's introduce our panel. So I'm pleased to introduce Tammy Trimble. Tammy is a senior research associate with the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute's Division of Data and Analytics. She's the lead author of the report that GHSA released on this session's topic. Her experience includes over 18 years in transportation policy research at VTTI, where she's worked on automated vehicles, of course, and associated education efforts. And her work on the implication of automation for motor vehicle codes was awarded the 2019 TRB John C. Vance Award. So Tammy, thank you for being with us today. Rob Patrick is a first responder specialist at Waymo, where he serves as a liaison to and provides training to first responders to assist them in operating safely around autonomous vehicles. Prior to Waymo, Rob was a law enforcement executive for 15 years, most recently as commander of the Special Operations Unit for the California Highway Patrol Valley Division. And in a 30-year career, Rob's designed and presented training on a wide variety of first responder topics and garnered extensive experience collaborating with stakeholders at all levels of government, really. His expertise includes incident management, investigative unit management, commercial vehicle safety, and multi-agency operations. So welcome to the panel, Rob. I'm glad to have you. At the end, we have Jim Epperson, who is the Deputy Commissioner and a 38-year veteran of the California Highway Patrol. His vast commercial vehicle expertise has allowed him to be very influential in the development of laws and regulation related to this technology. He's very active with AMVA, including previously being a member of their Autonomous Vehicle Committee and AMVA's Law Enforcement Standing Committee and the Caltrans Autonomous Vehicle Visioning Group. He was also co-chair of CVSA's Enforcement and Industry Modernization Committee, which addressed commercial aspects of AVs, the California Partners for Advanced Transportation Technology Truck Platooning Project, And on top of all that, he leads the CHP AV working group. So I think we invited the right guy. Thanks for being here, Jim. And then finally, we have Mufaddal Ezzy, who is the Senior Director of Public Affairs and State and Local Government Relations at Aurora, where he leads a team advancing Aurora's government relations and public policy initiatives across the United States. And prior to Aurora, he was head of public policy for Western US states at Waymo and served as Google's California Manager for Public Policy and Government Relations for 6 years, where he was deeply involved in then the Google self-driving car project, which of course became eventually Waymo. And before Google, he was an advisor in the California State Senate for nearly a decade. So thank you for being with us today. So I want to start by asking what are the needs out there? So Tammy, what did we find when we did the research to put together this paper and talk to some folks in this community? What are the views you found within the first responder community about the needs for preparation and training?
Thanks, Russ. Before I answer, I would like to thank GHSA and State Farm for sponsoring this research and allowing us to take this on. And I'd really like to extend a special thanks to all of those first responders and other stakeholders who are willing to meet with us and provide input and share their insights. So what we found was there's really not a one-size-fits-all approach that we can take moving forward. We found that the needs and desires for training and preparation vary across responder types, and even within those responders, what they're looking for depending on the size of their agency. Thinking about hands-on training, we know that's desired and that's effective, but it's not practical, especially if you're in a smaller rural area. So we found a desire in law enforcement to look for training opportunities that already existed, such as roll calls, to provide presentations or short videos. When we looked at EMS, they expressed a preference for asynchronous training that could be taken wherever they were located at their convenience, that was self-paced and preferably would have some component of continuing education involved. We also found a different need for the level of detail required. So when we talked to the crash reconstructionists, they were really interested in the deep details, the technical aspects, what technologies are available, what data is being collected, how can they access that data, when should they access that data. When we talked to fire personnel, they reminded us that there's a treasure trove of data already available with the NFPA's training program for electric and hybrid vehicles, and that training will likely be beneficial moving forward. So they wanted to remind us that that's a resource that's already available that will be applicable. But thinking generally, we know that the general population of which first responders are a part of, there's a lot of misconception about what ADAS technologies can do and what ADS technologies can do. We also have a very different backgrounds in how familiar we are with automobiles and automobile technologies in general. So providing some base level of education that explained what those technologies were capable of, how they could be misused, providing that better understanding, we think that's the immediate need in the short term.
Of course. So Jim, as sort of active duty law enforcement, what are you hearing from law enforcement officers that you work with?
So what she just said is absolutely nail on the head. And also, thank you very much for the invite. I appreciate being here. We've had an opportunity in California that you don't necessarily have across the nation, which leads me to my main point, which is it depends what your agency is, where you are, how often you see this. It varies greatly across the country and what your main objective is. So, I mean, as California Highway Patrol, as a traffic safety organization, this is something that we are generally greatly involved with. And, you know, my office is about an hour away from Silicon Valley. So if I'm talking to, you know, Menlo Park PD, Menlo Park Fire, they're completely on board. They see these things all the time. They're familiar with it on all different levels of autonomy. If I'm working with IACP or AMVA, more broad group, you know, you get crickets a lot when you start talking about how many times have you interacted with this and what are your protocols in order to interact with these vehicles. So it really varies greatly across the state. And for any response agency, you know, you start talking about training and these kind of things that are coming up, and everybody says in the future, and they're coming up quickly, but we're all trying to deal with things that are right now. I have, and all agencies have, tremendous amount of training that we have to do right now and things that we have to be aware of that affect our everyday life. if you look at the totality just in California, the number of vehicles that are out there, talking a minuscule fraction of all the other vehicles that I have to deal with right now. So where it's somewhere in the back of everybody's mind, they're not really focusing on it at the moment. And I think papers such as this to kind of let everybody know, hey, you need to start thinking about this. I was just talking to the group at the CTA, the California Trucking Association, and I bring up autonomous trucks and they all want to throw tomatoes at me because they don't want their job taken. But at the same time, I'm telling them, you have to start thinking about this. And really in most places in the country, that's where we're at.
Mm-hmm. So Rob and Mufaddal, you guys you run companies that are already starting to do some of this work in the field in areas where there's deployment. In fact, it's kind of like your main role is to provide that kind of training. So what are you hearing from your law enforcement partners?
Well, precisely. That is my role within Waymo. And I think one of the most important things that I've seen that's so encouraging is the enthusiasm for this kind of training. There's a hunger to understand what levels of technology are operating in their particular jurisdiction, how it works, how they might interact with it, what they might be able to anticipate in future interaction with AVs. And, I thought it was amazing. And thank you for the great work on the report from Tammy and VTTI. Much of the feedback that I get from my first responder training classes pretty much mimics Tammy's findings. So they really want to know that there's those probably 6 big ideas that they're very interested in understanding in order to be able to operate safely. And we try to manage that Waymo to provide first responders with as much of that information as possible, first of all, through in-person training. And as Jim rightly points out, we understand that there's a lot of demand for resources and a multitude of mandatory training out there. So we try to give them as much information in as little bit of time as we can. We also provide them with some external resources. We have an emergency response guidebook which explains interaction with the vehicle, what to anticipate if you make an enforcement stop, how to disengage the vehicle, what if the vehicle should need to be towed. It also addresses concerns from the fire side about high voltage areas and battery disconnection. And we provide an instructional video. So we have that emergency response guidebook and law enforcement interaction protocol for all of our vehicles. And then we have an informational video, which is available to first responders at waymo.com under the first responder tab. So I've found that those resources are very beneficial to the first responder community. Also, they just want a point of contact, somebody they can speak to when they do have questions. And of course, they have me, and then we also have a 24/7 hotline that if they need immediate information, they can call. So that's the basic input I've gotten. But as I said, predominantly, it's nice to see the enthusiasm for this kind of training.
That's excellent. So Mufaddal, same thing.
Yeah, I would echo those comments. And again, I think I want to also start by thanking GHSA and all the law enforcement partners that have taken time to be here today. I think echoing Deputy Commissioner Epperson's comments, there's so many things that you have to do every single day to keep our roads safe. Taking some time out to participate in a conference like this and engage in a dialogue around emerging technologies is really important. And so we're just so thankful to have the opportunity and appreciate all you do. I think one of the things that you were talking about, Rob, was this idea that there's a lot of content that we're pushing, right? So there's some things that are similar, right, across the industry. You're starting to see some things beginning to gel in ways that are covered in the report, or even AVSC that's put together some good guidelines for first responder and law enforcement interaction plans. But there's also a lot of work that we're doing reactively too. So we actually get a lot of folks out in the law enforcement first responder community who are reaching out to us saying, can we come and talk to you and learn more about what this technology is? It may not be in our jurisdiction today, right? We're far from Silicon Valley, but this is something we know is coming, and they come with a really positive, hunger to learn, and that really is something that we're really excited about. So when those opportunities present themselves, we're happy to host folks at our offices. We're happy to do webinars or Zoom calls, as we're doing right now, given sort of the nature of the pandemic, and providing that information and answering those questions so that as this technology starts to roll out in your communities, you know what to expect, and perhaps most importantly, as Rob said, you know who to call.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest, but you mentioned law enforcement engagement plans and in-person training and training videos, but does that compete also with other kinds of training that law enforcement is involved in? Like, how does that fit into everything that we always got to work on in the ranking of priorities and different kinds of training. Is that a challenge, you think, within what we're talking about today?
I mean, for the way that we've experienced, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do is really kind of focus where our operations are at, right? So understanding, so if you look at kind of even NHTSA's A/B test initiative, where they've got some good data on their website that starts to track where this technology is really starting to take hold, where the testing and development is happening. There's some places that would be sort of natural places that you would assume, like, for example, Silicon Valley, but then there's other places around the country as well. We're starting to see pockets of this development and R&D really hitting the roads. And so what we've tried to do is take a pretty focused approach, right? Understanding a lot of the challenges and a lot of the demands that law enforcement, first responder community has on their time, and say, okay, if we're in Texas, which we are right now, if we're in California, which we are right now, really focus on those institutions first, because we know that's kind of where the rubber's meeting the road, and then kind of branch out from there. And what we find is that for those stakeholders, they're making more time, right? Because this is something that's in their communities right now, and finding ways to kind of work it into the various other things that they're trying to balance.
Sure, of course. So Tammy, when you were speaking to representatives from the first responder community about training and what do we need, what are some of the things that they said, look, here's what we don't need and what we don't want. What are some of the pitfalls we want to avoid?
Sure. One of the things that we found was that they don't want or need outdated training. We know these technologies are continuously advancing. So if I have training, but it's on a pilot deployment that is never coming to my area, that I'll never see, that's been outdated and the company's moved on to something else, that's not wanted. In providing that up-to-date training, we found that long, overly technical, boring videos were not desired at all. Rather, they want short, engaging, easy to understand videos. So that's not saying skip the technical aspect, that's saying please present it in a way that I can understand it, the average person can understand it, not an engineer sitting at a university, which I happen to be. But yeah, so understandable information. And then if you have a handout, we don't want a pamphlet that is overly technical. Maybe have the few key takeaway bullet points, or file that information in a database where we know where we can access it if it's that important, but a handout alone is not needed. And finally, they wanted training from people who were vetted. You talked about people who were champions and calling you. So they need to trust the person presenting the information. So untrusted, unvetted sources weren't desirable. And we know that the leadership plays a role in getting that information down to the frontline workers. So having someone go get that technical training and then share that further down the line with their coworkers was a better approach.
Yeah. So police officers and crash investigators often have to determine liability in a crash. And a crash happens involving a vehicle with autonomous vehicle technology. And then the question is like, well, what exactly happened? Was the car driving? Was the person driving? Should the person have been paying attention to or monitoring the technology? So are police officers concerned about how do we determine liability when these things happen?
So, wow, that particular question, that varies greatly in and of itself, crash investigations across the country. And if any of you have had time to look at the way that it's done differently across the country, some states don't even assign fault. Some states do. We are a fault determiner state, so we absolutely do everything that's necessary to determine that. Other states don't have the time or the resources, so they're just collecting the data. And then it's kind of on the involved party. So it all depends on what you're doing in that particular case. But in general, again, it's how often do you see it? How aware is the officer or the person who's engaging with this thing? And most of the time, I've talked to someone, they bring up those exact same things. They say, well, how are we going to tell what the car did? And I stop them for a second and I say, well, have you ever investigated a hit and run? And they said, well, yeah. I said, well, so you didn't have a driver then? No. Ever investigated a fatal collision with just the solo driver? They said, well, yeah. Did you have any problem determining fault then? They said, well, no. I said, well, this isn't any different. This is no different than the standard investigation you do. Use your investigative tools. You just don't have a driver statement. And I guarantee none of them have ever gone up to a driver, and even when you're collecting a driver statement, you haven't said, so what were you thinking at that time? That's not the question that's out there. It's just, what did you see? What did you do? Those things, hopefully at some point, will have an EDR that's in the car that collects all these things. There's been some great work done, and SAE actually just updated in July. I think it's 3917, J3917, which are their new recommendations for an EDR, and that'll tell us those two things. What did the car see? What did the car do? Because that's really all I need to know. So it's just, again, it's getting the familiarity, and you bring up a very good point about how much time do we have to do all these things. So we've broken it down when we put out that information, like we talk about it during part of our crashes. We've updated our 555, which is our form, to match the muck. So there's actually on page 2 now, it talks about levels of autonomy and so forth, so we can start gathering data. So as we gather that data, when we start to see it more often, we know, okay, now we need to be more aggressive because we're actually seeing things involved there. So again, it's just getting familiar with the situation and putting it in the right perspective. I think all law enforcement, when they're investigating these things, already has the tools to do it. They're just not aware of the fact.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the sense of we have EDRs or event data recorders, the black boxes that are in cars that collect vital information about a crash in the few seconds before and after. And I guess it's possible we could download all the EDR data for any kind of crash. But you talk to police officers and they'll say, well, we could do that, but it's a pain for a whole host of reasons. And a lot of the time, you don't need the data you can use the tools you have at your disposal, and you may not be able to figure out what happened without that perspective. But kind of a related question is sometimes you can't. And so cars that have this technology, whether it's an EDR or other kinds of computers on board, are collecting information about driving, and they may capture information relevant to a crash. So is there this related concern about preserving that digital evidence when you do need it? How do we, what are the thoughts there, and what ought we be thinking about in that respect?
So on that note, you know, I've done computer forensics for quite a few years, and the first thing we tell everybody is don't mess with it. So if you don't know what you're doing, please don't mess with it. And if you are going to mess with it in any way, shape, or form, please document exactly what you do. So we're going back to the standard protocols that we tell them. If you're grabbing a laptop for that you need to secure for evidence or anything else like that, that we need some sort of chain with it, and we need to know exactly what you did with it. You know, part of the problem now is everybody's writing, you know, their own programming, and it's apples and oranges compared to different manufacturers and so forth, which is great because it's bringing out new availability, and it's bringing out new tech. But forensically, it's a nightmare. We don't have the plug and play devices that we do for any other type of device that we have out there right now for trucks or anything else, where we have a plug and play, we can connect and we know what we're looking at. That doesn't exist right now. And the other thing too is most manufacturers, that's an awful lot of data to keep on board. So the majority of the manufacturers are uploading that to the cloud so that you can keep a reasonable amount on the unit that's mobile at the time, because there's just too much data to keep doing that. So realizing that you're probably not going to get the most up-to-date data depending on your time frame when you're able to get to that too, that you're going to have to go to the manufacturer. And I do want to say one thing. If you're looking at this, if they're coming to your jurisdiction, I've been blessed with being able to speak to a lot of different manufacturers, these two in particular. If you call them and say, hey, we have questions, we need to know how to do this, they've been just wonderful at coming out and showing us and telling us and helping us from the executive level on down. They want you to have the information. So as a first responder, keep that in mind.
If I could,
of course,
if I could just on Jim's point, I believe what I've seen when it comes to this, to the need for the data, the need for the information, is that it goes back to what we talked about before, that what they really want to understand is who can I talk to that can explain to me what data might be available, and who can I talk to that can explain to me what the process might look like. So because we've learned this through some of the trainings that I've conducted, we've put some systems in place. So law enforcement has that ability to contact, you know, along the lines of the different technologies. That's the other thing they really want to understand is what the technologies that you're currently operating with in my jurisdiction, what is available there, and how do I go about getting it?
Yeah. Well, I know that Waymo and Aurora have very publicly put forth their philosophy of putting safety first. And this conversation makes it sound like these companies are conspiring to hide, you know, crashes that happen and they're a technology that doesn't work, something like that. And I think ultimately it doesn't serve any company to do that, because we already have this uphill battle to try and get people interested in this stuff, because this will ultimately save lives, and we want this technology out there. And the best way to do that, of course, is to work together. So, but speaking of which, there have been many public surveys about automated vehicle technology, and there's still the sense of uncertainty about it, and people will tell you, I'm not sure I want to ride in these vehicles, but it seems to change over time. And it sounds like within law enforcement of the first responder community, there's also this range of people are enthusiastic or interested, but also maybe they're not with the same level of familiarity. So do you think that like the above average exposure to highway safety issues makes a difference? And when you go out and talk to law enforcement, do they kind of get that aspect of it immediately?
I'm happy to take that just to start, and would love to kind of hear what the colleagues think. Is, I think, yeah, we've seen a variance, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with kind of where you're seeing this technology first, right? And I think consistent with what the commissioner said, some of those pockets where you're seeing more of this sort of L4 development happen, you're seeing much more sort of understanding, a lot more interaction, and then in other places perhaps not as much. But I think big picture, there is a lot of room for education broadly, both in terms of the law enforcement, first responder community, but also the broader sort of consumer sort of public, right? Just across the various spectrum of automated vehicle technologies. I think, Tammy, you were talking earlier about the distinctions between ADAS, and I think Nat was talking about this morning as well, for those of you who were to catch the session, advanced driver assist systems versus truly L4 automated driving systems, which is what companies like ours are working on. There's a pretty big distinction there, and we have a very important responsibility to sort of be out there working with all the partners in this room to help make that distinction clear, I think in part to help you do your jobs better, right? But then also to make sure that the public and consumers are appropriately informed and understand what these things are, so that what their expectations are in terms of when they're inside those vehicles are appropriately calibrated to what those technologies are capable of, and perhaps what they're not capable of.
Yes, specifically, I can tell you, if you talk about law enforcement as opposed to the general public, if I'm talking to guys that have 5 to 10 years on the job, I can talk to them about deep neural networks, and we can talk tech, and they have some idea of what's going on there, and it's tangible to them. The longer on the department I go, 10, 15, 20 years, that enthusiasm starts to wane. The familiarity starts to wane a little bit. And they're more focused on the traditional job of things that are going to hurt them. The longer you've been in your career, you tend to get a little more aware of all the things that can cause you harm in the job, and this isn't seen as one. So, but I think that's the same as the general public. The 20 to 40-year-olds are more engaged in this type of tech as opposed to the older generation.
And I think it points out the importance of education within the first responder community. And one of the things that I noticed in the training sessions I've conducted is that there is a significant level of misunderstanding associated with what ADAS can do and what L4 vehicle technology can do. And it's important, I think, first and foremost, for first responders to have a grasp on that, so we understand when do we need a human driver behind the wheel paying attention, even though we have some technology assisting us, and when are we using vehicles that were designed from the beginning not to have a human driver.
So there's this difference between ADAS and higher levels of automation, and in the safety discussion, we often focus our discussion about policy and regulation on these higher levels of automation. Even though they're in the hands of these companies that have hundreds of people working on the safety of them, every single day. Meanwhile, you have ADAS systems or technology that are being let out into the public behind the wheel of the average driver. You guys have met the driving public. Are they, you have a range of the safest drivers, perhaps the not so safe drivers. So when we talk about safety, should we be focusing more on some of those lower levels of automation and seeing how we can prevent some of those crashes from happening?
So I look back 10 years, and consistently the conversation for developing companies was we're not going to bother with level 3. There's too many things that can go wrong in level 3. There's too much of an expectation of the driver. We don't want to get into that, so we're going to jump over that and do what we can to start at level 4. And I think we're kind of seeing that now. there needs to be more of a general education when you buy these type of vehicles of what is actually available there, because it's mostly unregulated across the country. I mean, even in California, unless you meet level 3, and it's pretty defined line, there isn't specific regulation for that. You can drive it, and you're kind of on your own for it, sitting back on the company's recommendations that you have. So yeah, there is a gap there, and I haven't seen someone come up with a resolution to exactly how that should be addressed. But as far as addressing it in law enforcement, I mean, you may or may not have seen, we did make an arrest in California for a driver of a Tesla who was sitting in the back seat while he was driving down the freeway. So, I mean, we have had these events, and there are tools in place to manage them. Those are the extreme. We hope we don't see more of those. But more specific training to that, I think, is needed on the horizon.
It's kind of a public education issue. And we have these SAE levels, 0 through 5. And I guess maybe it's helpful for engineering, but for the general public, I guess the question is, do we need a new framework? Is it time to break up the SAE levels and separate the highest levels from the lower levels for the purpose of how we talk to consumers about what their responsibilities are? Or maybe so. So some have recently said that when it comes to automated vehicles, the question is not when, but where. And that kind of suggests that anytime soon, we're probably not going to see widespread high levels of automation, but rather in the near term, we're probably going to be seeing mostly more localized deployments, whether it be shuttles or ride hailing services or trucking. Does that kind of track with what we ought to be expecting over the next few years?
Well, I think, at least from my perspective, we had to start somewhere.
Of course.
And so, I mean, as you may be aware, Waymo has been operating the world's first and only fully autonomous rider services in South Phoenix now since 2018. We recently welcomed riders in San Francisco as part of our Trusted Tester program there. We're operating our commercial and cargo operations in Texas. We've tested in 25 cities. And I think the point is every one of those endeavors gives us additional knowledge and information that over time will enable us in the coming years to scope the use of the technology more rapidly.
So technology always fills a void, and the voids right now are in local, and that's definitely going forward, especially with some of the automated charging stations that have come out recently, which is fantastic to see those. But the other place is trucking industry. So in the trucking industry for the last 15 years has been seeing a decline in truck drivers. And that's it, hate to say it, but that's a monotonous job. That is a perfect place for some type of automation. So there have been a lot of, and I mean a lot of investments over the last 2 years directly in that area. And yes, absolutely with the local, but definitely the long haul truckers, that is someplace else that there is a defined need. And I think this is the technology that will fill the void from.
I just add that, there's sort of the technological element, and then there's the market element, right? And so in terms of the technological piece, right, there's a lot of work that's been done over the course of the last, number of years to sort of get the technology to a place that, it can do the things that it needs to do when it needs to do it within sort of that defined L4 kind of operational design domain that we talk about. That's an element of that now, I think, where a lot of folks are working, including Aurora, is really figuring out where is that going to make the most sense in terms of the application, right? So we talk about how we're working on deploying the Aurora driver safely, quickly, and broadly. And broadly is sort of that third element of our mission, which is we're trying to deploy this driver across a series of different use cases across ride hailing, like goods delivery, and trucking, with trucking sort of kind of leading in terms of the first thing that we're planning to do. So I think we talk about sort of this fueling the rocket ship type approach in terms of how we're developing our business. And, you know, the rocket sort of sits at the launch pad for a little bit, right, while it's sort of getting geared up and everything's figuring out. When it takes off, it really takes off. And so that's kind of how we think about it, right, which is, you know, in the early stages, right, you'll see some pilots, you'll see some things happening kind of more localized to kind of get the nuances of those applications figured out. To some degree separate and apart from the technology, but connected to it. But once that starts to click, it starts to move pretty fast, right? And so that scaling can be pretty rapid. So that's kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, and first responder partnerships are probably a big part of that, right?
100%, absolutely.
Yeah. So Tammy, I understand VTTI is also working on a related project. Can you share a little bit about that and what we can expect for the future?
Sure, we have a related project I'll tell you about, and then a couple other ones that I think tie on some other issues we talked about today. The first project is looking specifically at law enforcement, and we're engaging with law enforcement across the country to try and find out in more detail, what training types and modes they'd find beneficial. And we'll have recommendations from that next year. We have another pilot demonstration project where we're looking at how ADS-equipped vehicles will interact with law enforcement and other road users in challenging situations. For example, a situation where the roadway is closed and there's someone directing traffic. How will the vehicle interact? Will it know what the police officer is telling it? So that's an exciting project that my colleague is actually here and he can answer more questions about after. And then we talked about electronic data recorders. And we're currently working on a project for NHTSA where we're looking to see what data is currently being collected and what data should be collected moving forward. And for that, we're identifying stakeholders and soliciting input. So if you're interested in that project, please stop and see me at our booth, and I'd be happy to share some more about that project with you after.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, VTTI, of course, is involved in all kinds of transportation efforts. And so I definitely encourage you all to stop by and look into that. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So I want to invite you to go to the microphone if you do have questions, and we can pose them to our panelists. And while you're thinking about that, we can keep talking. I wanted to ask, certainly our audience, many in our audience are State Highway Safety Office officials. And what do you think is the role for the State Highway Safety Offices when it comes to the deployment of automated vehicle technology? Do you think there's a role with, I mean, our members, the State Highway Safety Office sit at this nexus between public education and sponsoring law enforcement training. So those seem like obvious areas for partnership to get involved in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about just over the course of the last couple of days is sort of this incredible megaphone, if you will, that the traffic safety offices have, right? Both in terms of the public, but then also kind of the law enforcement, first responder community, and your ability to synthesize really complicated information and push it out across to enhance sort of road safety writ large is just incredible. And I think that, thinking carefully about how we leverage that power and that megaphone to really educate the public, our law enforcement partners, et cetera, on kind of these types of issues, this technology is probably an area that we should all be thinking about collaborating around.
Yeah, OTS, I mean, California or nationally, OTS tends to, they have the broader audience. If I'm talking, that's one thing, but if OTS is talking, it's a much broader audience picking all that up. So that's extremely important. That combined with their grant programs, which will probably come up for training and so forth in this, I think they're extremely valuable tool that will be tapped in this area.
Sure, that makes sense. Any audience questions? Sir. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you to the panel. One quick question. We've talked about the importance of law enforcement's involvement in how this technology is going to be documented and how it's going to be investigated. We know also that today, more than ever, law enforcement is challenged in ways that it's never been, and particularly in the area of training. And so how does the panel see the training and the education that's going to be required as we move forward into this automated world? How does that rank in priority right now for the agencies that you've all interacted with? And then I'll have a brief follow-up.
Well, to answer your question right now, it's a little low because with all the other priorities that are going on, there isn't a large enough deployment that really suggests that more resources need to be put. So, I can tell you for our department, we are looking at, like I said, looking at where the vehicles are, how many are being deployed, and then respond, systematically with that deployment. Because, as well as I do, I mean, firing your weapon, all the things that are required by law, that law enforcement and quite frankly, fire has to train on all the time. This is not required by law right now, that training is required. So you have to slip it in there in the areas that relate to probably specific other topics.
Yeah, and if I could just offer a comment on that, and one of the most important things I think regarding that is, having been a law enforcement trainer for many years, I understand the resource demands, especially in today's situation. But so the important thing is to provide first responders with as much information as you can provide them in as small amount of time as you can take away from their other priorities, and then to give them a resource. So when they walk away and questions come up later, they have a place to go to get those questions answered.
Sure, it's going to be a long-term process, over time, it sounds like.
Very good. And Deputy Commissioner, I think you put it very well, in that it's kind of a little bit of both, where agencies that are being faced with this are acting on it, and for agencies that don't interact with this on a regular basis. But when we look, as the Highway Safety Office Director, we rely on that information that's collected at scene by law enforcement to give us the data so that we can analyze those trends and we can develop those countermeasures that will eventually help the industry to prevent these crashes from happening in the first place, if in fact that it's something related to the autonomous vehicle or the technology associated with it. I think back at the time, the troopers that I worked with, many of them, as the Deputy Commissioner said, on the newer end of the scale, they're more likely to become, more interested in the IT aspect of it, where the dinosaurs such as myself would probably be a lot less interested in that part of it. But how do I would argue that we may be even behind the scale right now when it comes to collecting those crash data points for ADAS. How do we prepare for the future, for this fundamental change in the way and the type of data we're collecting? We're no longer going to be focused solely on the human factors as part of those investigations, but it's going to be the combination of the human factor with technology, and then eventually the technology factors. I know that there's a lot in that question, but and a little hypothetical in there, but I'll leave it up to the panel. And thank you very much for your time and a great discussion.
So that actually brings up several different things. So most of the crashes that have involved autonomous vehicles have been of the type that wouldn't normally be reported. They're low speed, low damage, no injury. So that complicates things a little bit, because you're not collecting that data at all. Local police departments aren't responding to that. We're one of the rare agencies that still, because of our focus, are able to take non-injury collisions. So that complicates it even more that that's not being taken up. But I can't emphasize enough, and no matter what group I'm speaking with, is the release, the last release of the MUC that talks about the levels of autonomy. And just like we've been doing for seatbelts for years and years, what was the seatbelt? Was it a lap belt? Was it what was it? We've been collecting that data for a long period of time. You have to start collecting this type of data as well. And the more we get, the better. So if we can get agencies across the country to start using those parameters, so like I said, we can see things coming, not just on a local, but a national scale, it'll help everybody plan for the future.
So you mentioned MUC compliance, and so the idea of bringing your state or your community's crash reporting form up to the MUC standard, which includes these new data fields for autonomous vehicle technology. But doing that, updating your crash report, it's not necessarily the quickest thing to do. You can't just add it in. It's probably a process to make a whole range of updates, right? I mean, are there challenges and for other states out there that might be looking to make those changes?
Well, we're in a unique position that everybody in California uses our form. Okay. There is actually a law that says you got to use our form if you're going to be doing crash investigations. So the crash unit actually, it takes them, it took us 6 months, because you have to have the policy with it, right? Because we're pushing the policy out, how to use that, because accuracy of the data being collected is what you want. Otherwise, if the data you're collecting isn't accurate, then then it's no good to you. So there had to be a certain amount of training with that. So we pushed out training programs with the update. So it kind of goes back to what I said before. You have to kind of work in the training in this area in places where you're doing training anyway, where it applies. So every time that a new update comes out for our reporting system, we do training associated with that, not just for our department, but for all other departments. So in this area, when the levels of SAE came out, it gave us an opportunity statewide to set out some training that said, hey, this is what the SAE levels are, this is what we need you to look for, and this is how you're going to identify them. So, I mean, in our case, you know, I've got a bunch of guys, that's all guys and gals, that's all they do is the forms and so forth. So, you know, I'm in a luxury situation. So like I said, it took about 6 months to get it pushed out once we decided to do so.
Well, I'm sure we're all looking forward to the data that yields, and that will be instructive. As they say, so goes California, often so goes the nation. So thanks for leading the way. Any other questions from the audience? Any questions? Well, let me ask this. As I mentioned, we have many state highway safety officers with us here today, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but might there be the potential for some kind of more explicit partnership on the state level between autonomous vehicle developers and state highway safety offices to partner to implement programs to address some of the issues that we've been dealing with today?
Well, we're all in the safety business. You know, Waymo, speaking for Waymo, safety has always been key. That's why we approach things the way we have. So, you know, certainly we would, in any conversation that's going to make our first responders or our public safer, we'd be happy to have a seat at the table.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I think, you know, this is, I think, an example, right, of that sort of spirit of partnership. And, you know, for example, even the report that VTTI put together, right, they took a lot of care to go out and talk to different industry folks. So we had folks, our sort of safety experts, folks from Nat's team who you heard from this morning, participate in some of those groups to really help inform even some of those papers that are being published. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so I think it's worth us sort of thinking about what are some of those targets that we want to hit and figuring out how we sort of collectively work towards those.
Those are excellent points. And everybody has to remember, and I forget myself sometimes, that this is the road to zero that we've talked about. You know, this is, you know, no traffic deaths outside of, you know, act of God or something else that gets in the way. This could, you know, reduce traffic deaths tremendously. We can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Well, we have another question. Go ahead, Jonathan.
All right, sometimes I just can't help myself, so apologies. We've got all these experts up there, and it's a related question. So we know this is the road to zero, but even in my own social circle, and when I talk to people about autonomous vehicles, there's so much hesitation. People say, you know, they only know about Tesla, they only know the negative stories. How do we get the good news out there? How do we get the public on board, so to speak, and excited about this technology? Because in a lot of the country, there's a lot of hesitation and maybe even more about this great technology.
So, you know, that brings up what I refer to as a terrible conundrum, is that the general public, I mean, those of us in traffic safety all know about it, but the general public is really not all too concerned, at least it seems, that we lose 39,000 people a year plus on our roads to traffic deaths. There just isn't the outcry that we'd like and the support that we'd like for that. But I guarantee you, absolutely, you start saying that robots are killing people, and that'll change. And that's just the perspective of it. And it's awful, but it's true, is that people, the general public is numb to other people killing people, but they are absolutely not when it comes to machines killing people. And that is going to be a very hard thing to overcome, to say that, yes, these vehicles are a positive thing, not a negative thing. It's incredibly important, which is why all the companies that I know of are going forward so methodically, because they can't have that happen. They know just one death that's caused is going to shut them down in the public eye for a long period of time. So yes, the education is out there, but also, you know, making sure somehow that the companies that are moving forward are the larger companies with the public's best interest in mind.
And I think to a significant degree, it kind of goes back to a forum like this. It's about, you know, we're human nature. We don't trust what we don't understand. So we need to be proactive about getting the understanding out there about the technology. How does it work? How do we interact with it? And as we start to have a greater comfort level about the technology, then we'll have greater trust.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know Waymo has efforts underway to tell the story, of certainly from the beginning of how beneficial this technology can be, and other companies as well are working on that. I know the GHSA is a member of the Partners for Autonomous Vehicle Education, or the PAVE campaign, and I think many of us here are involved in it as well. And the idea is just that, is to give honest information about the benefits that this technology can bring. Oh, we have another question. Go ahead, sir.
Just to follow up on that topic, I heard a university professor speaking about a year ago saying that, well, if automated vehicles can reduce fatalities by 90%, that'll mean only about 4,000 people killed on the roads, and the public will be fine with that. Just curious about what you think that would be like in a situation where you've got only 10% of the fatalities, but those 10% are, I wouldn't have said killed by robots, but just curious in your perspectives on that.
So one thing that in all the companies I talk to is the transportation arena is a messy place. A lot of different stuff happens out there, and a lot of it is hard to control. And we have, and I'm sure you've heard, in California, we have a huge problem right now with freeway shootings. If you're in your own car right now and someone shoots at you, you can accelerate away. If you're in an autonomous vehicle, they're not going to recognize that. So there's a lot of things to still be thought through, and a lot of things to be looked at. And I would not even guess what the public is going to think about any of that in a general sense. The public is a fickle thing, all depending on what the current trend is at that given time. I think if it's be a huge benefit to show the overall reduction, I think everybody would see that as a positive, but still, as they get more familiar with the technology and so forth, we first got cell phones, everybody was sure they were getting brain cancer. We finally, I think, have gotten past that. And I think it'll be the same learning curve for autonomous vehicles.
Sounds like there's a prediction, but does anyone think that's a reason to stop doing what we're trying to do? No, not. I mean, I think we just have to see where this takes us, and hopefully it takes us in a better place, and we'll address whatever safety challenges we have to face in the future. I'm not seeing any more questions, so last call. I know it's late in the day, but why don't you join me in a round of applause for our panel today? Thank you for being here. Thank you all for your partnership, and thank you, Tammy, for your team's work on our new resource for the highway safety community. That will conclude our session today. I hope you're able to get out there and enjoy Denver tonight. Please plan to join us here in this room, the same place, 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning for our general session on equity. And with that, I hope you have a great evening.
Russ, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.